also known as a money bond, creates a two-tiered system of justice in which people who can afford their release go home to their families, and those without financial resources are forced to unnecessarily suffer in jail. Before one ever sees a judge, someone with means can buy their release. Cash bail does not keep people safe, it locks up people who are poor. In other words, the constitutional right of innocent until proven guilty only applies to the wealthy. Those unable to meet bail become trapped in a cycle of detention that leads to more deprivation for those individuals and their families, as well as burdensome costs to our society. Today, there are several efforts underway to stop this vicious cycle that deserve our attention and support. We have three fantastic speakers tonight who will share what they know, and Susan Noonan will now introduce them. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Beth. And first, I just wanted to mention that last February 2020, we did have a meeting on, actually mostly on cash bail, to educate some of our members in the community about the whole issue of cash bail. We had Dr. Ebony Ruland, Julie Wilson, Bill Gallagher, a criminal defense lawyer, and Stephen Jones as our speakers. So they did give us a lot of basic information, but many things have happened since then, and there is some pending legislation, and we thought it was time to give all of our members and community members and everybody else who joins us tonight an update on what is going on and what is still happening. So we are thrilled to have our three speakers tonight. I'm going to just give intros for each of them. Greer Ashbury from the American Civil Liberty Union is the organizing strategist for the ACLU of Ohio in Southwest Ohio. She comes to the ACLU by way of congregation and neighborhood-based community organizing in both Florida and Cincinnati. And could I ask everybody to mute if you're not muted, please? Thank you. As a member of ACLU, Ohio's organizing team, she works directly with community members and everyday activists who want to put ACLU's values to work in their community. She lives in College Hill with her partner. Welcome, Greer. We have a long history with you. It's good to see you back. And next we have Dr. Zaria Davis, who I have had the pleasure of getting to know through another group that we're in. And she is a senior associate with the Pretrial Justice Institute, where she advocates for safe, fair, and effective pretrial justice practices and policies through racial justice. She previously served as the executive director of Lincoln Heights Outreach, assisting families toward self-sufficiency. They have one of the best health centers in Lincoln Heights. I love their health center. Dolores Lindsay, she's wonderful. As a 2019 Just Leadership USA Leading with Conviction Fellow, Dr. Davis is helping to build a movement to decarcerate the United States. She's owner of New Direction Coaching and Consulting, an LLC, which helps individuals through life transitions, career, or personal shifts, and nonprofit and reentry consultation. In 2019, she launched Filling the Gap, a nonprofit that addresses many of the gaps in service for formerly incarcerated individuals. She serves on the steering committee for the Unlock Higher Ed Coalition, is founding member of the Cincinnati chapter of All of Us or None. So she's doing a lot. She holds a Doctor of Social Work from Capella University, a master's in social work from UC, and a BA in sociology from Wilberforce. Welcome, Dr. Davis. And last and certainly not least, we have Ms. Chastity Bowman, who is the founder and executive director of Opportunities People's Justice Leaders, an organization geared toward assuring those incarcerated receive fair and humane treatment and that their civil rights are not violated. OPJL began in March of 2020 through the global pandemic, during which they received a lot of credibility for their aggressive campaigns geared toward COVID-19 for people incarcerated. Chastity is a part of the 2021 Just Leadership USA cohort, as well as a current member at GCU University pursuing her degree in political science. Good for you. That was my major. She currently serves as the Prison Committee Chairperson for the Cincinnati NAACP chapter, is a member of Communities for Sheriff Accountability. I'd never heard that before, as well as the Executive Director of Operation Change Cincinnati. She's the wife of Rufus Bowman, who is currently incarcerated, and they have 4 children. So through the incarceration experience, Chastity and Rufus have collaborated and created a peer-led organization inside of his facility called the Stay Focused Movement. It's a mentorship program that starts on the inside to help those incarcerated returning home, when they return home, to stay focused on their goals to be successful. So she is a proud activist and voice for those who don't have one. So welcome to our 3 panelists. And I am going to turn this over to Dr. Davis, who is going to have a dialogue with Greer and Chastity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us this evening. Just want to start out by just kind of setting the tone. So I am going to start with just sharing some information, and each of the other panelists will share information as well. And then we're just going to engage in conversation. If people have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I know there is a Q&A at the end, but if it's something that's relevant that we need to elevate at that time, please feel free to let us know so that we can address that particular issue. So as mentioned, I work with the Pretrial Justice Institute. I've actually been with the organization for the last 2 years. My anniversary, my 2-year anniversary, is this week. And I really got started in this work actually on a local level. So for those who don't know me and are not familiar with me, I have been a person that's been impacted by the system. I am formerly incarcerated, and it was really my lived experience that got me into this work. I actually resided in 3 different jails during the time of my incarceration, in addition to federal prison. And so for me, it is a very personal and passion of mine to do this work. I got started with the local bail committee. And then when the opportunity came for me to do work with PJI, which is more of a statewide effort, I definitely was interested and jumped at the opportunity. The one thing that I really appreciate about the organization, which has been around for close to 45 years now, is that we have really focused a lot on looking at racial justice, as well as looking at socioeconomics as it relates to people who are being detained in our current jails. And so we actually often say there is no pretrial justice without racial justice within this work. And so as we look at the work that we do and how this impacts all of us, right? When we're talking about the Senate bill as well as the House bill that we'll speak a little bit more about shortly, some of our goals around pretrial justice is to achieve equity, to reduce harm, the harms of mass incarceration, and then also to eliminate the financial conditions. So as Greer will talk a little bit later about some of the financial aspects of what we're going to be looking at, and as we kind of chime in, you'll understand that that's a huge piece to what we've been dealing with. We have people that oftentimes have bond amounts that are set at really high amounts, and they are unable to pay. And historically, you're supposed to look at people's ability, but we don't oftentimes see that happen in practice. So we also look at what we call the 3 M's, which are so important when we're talking about pretrial justice, and that's maximizing liberties, maximizing court appearance, as well as public safety. So we often hear a lot about public safety, like people run on oh, we're going to keep everybody safe. And I always question, what does that look like, right? How do you define public safety? Because public safety looks different to every person, depending on the community they're from, what their exposure has been. And so it's really critical to know your audience and know who you're working with and talking to when you're talking about these things. But when we talk about pretrial justice, we want to make sure that people are safe, but we also want to make sure that people's liberties are taken into consideration as well. And so we do a lot of training in the community. We provide a lot of resources and services, and I'll make sure that I drop those in the chat before we leave today. But we focus in on a few things that really are kind of these myth buster types of things when we talk about pretrial justice. And so one of those is that, although we say that people are presumed innocent until proven guilty, we have realized that we really support the presumption of guilt for people, especially people of color and the working poor. So when a person gets arrested, we see on the news, like, this person's been arrested, or, you know, we hear about a person being arrested, and we oftentimes jump to the conclusion that they're guilty. We don't know anything about the case, but it's just how it's been framed. And so the presumption of innocence has really been lost in a lot of spaces. And so it's really critical that we get back to that, right? That people have the opportunity to fight for their freedom in this particular situation. And so as we look at different reform efforts, it's really critical that we look at how do these things factor into what we're doing. And I know we have several people who are in judicial spaces on this call. And so I always challenge, you know, the judges that I interact with, like, you know, how much do you really know? I mean, I do training, we do a fundamentals training, and I have judges from all over the country that come through our trainings. I've actually offered the trainings here in Hamilton County for free, and I haven't had any takers, you know. So it just challenges me to think, like, are people really interested in learning about, like, some of the things that are happening nationally, like what, you know, how are things showing up currently and not always reflecting on the past. And then we just look at, like, some of the racial disparities as well. Systemic racism has a huge part in the whole idea of arrest. And, you know, just looking at certain types of charges that people get, depending on the community, the level of policing that exists in that community, all of those things factor in when we're talking about who's sitting in our jail. And then the other piece that we also need to keep in mind is that a large number of the people that are currently sitting in our jail are in their pretrial. So they have not been convicted of a crime. They have been arrested, they have been booked, but there still should be that presumption of innocence that exists. And unfortunately, in most jails, regardless if you've been convicted or if you're in their pretrial, the treatment is the same, the interaction is the same, the access to resources is the same. And so how are you fighting your case if you don't have access to resources and services, or you have limited access because you may not have the financial means to connect with the people that you need to? So just kind of keeping those things in mind. And then that kind of leads to oftentimes people being pressured to then take pleas. Right? So when people are under duress, when they feel pressure from their family, pressure from their attorney, we see that over 90% of cases are pleas. They're not going to trial. And so that's a concern when we are supposed to be having justice being served, or people are supposed to face a jury of their peers, all these different concepts that we're taught growing up, but we don't actually see that in action right now. So it's really important as we're talking about bail reform and we think about what we want to see here in Ohio, like what that really looks like and how it shows up here in Hamilton County as well. Another thing that another truth, as we call them, a hard truth that we share about is that millions of people serve time in jail each year without conviction through arrest, money, bond, and culture. So we talk about these bond amounts. You know, there are times where people may have a low bond amount, like in our minds, right? But for someone that has nothing, it could be $1 million. And so, you know, you have to look at people's ability to pay. And again, we'll talk about how that connects to this bill, but we have to look at people's ability to pay and not just kind of have blanket statements like this is the charge, so this is the amount. As mentioned earlier by Beth, the disparity is oftentimes around social economics. So you can have two people that are charged with the same crime and they may have the same bond amount, but if a person is wealthy and a person is poor, guess what? That poor person is still sitting in our jail. And so they can't often fight their cases the way that person with money is going to be able to. So just kind of, you know, keeping those things in your mind at the forefront when we're talking about just the changes that we want to see. And I'll just throw this stat out. Unconvicted people accounted for 90% of the jail growth since 2000. And so most of them are unable to post money bond. And so I oftentimes we'll share different stats. And if anybody's interested, we have a whole website that's called the University of Pretrial that has all types of research and data that you can access at any point in time, as well as free courses and paid courses. And then another truth is we believe that anyone that's arrested is risky, right? And we oftentimes ignore their victimization. And so a lot of times when people are going into our jails, they have needs that have not been met. It may be mental health, it may be substance abuse, they may be a victim of some type of physical abuse themselves. And so understanding that there needs to be other measures in place to really address the needs within our community. Jail is a consequence. Jail is a reactionary, a consequence and a reactionary tool. It's not being proactive. So what can we do as a community to be more proactive to ensure that we aren't having so many people going into our jails, especially people who have been victimized themselves? And we see that a lot. You'll hear people's stories and you'll hear about how they experienced some type of tragedy or trauma in their lives, which led to something else, which led them to the decisions that they made. But how about as a community, we do more transformative justice in the beginning, where we're actually investing in communities and investing in people. So I just, I think that that's important. And then we'll talk about the financial aspect of this as well. But understanding that we as local taxpayers, we pay to support the jail, which keeps people oftentimes sick. So I've heard so many people within the jail system say, we have the largest mental health facility in the state. That is not a good thing, right? Like the jail is not set up to be a mental health facility. So if we're having so many people coming in that have mental health issues, then there needs to be some other type of solution to address that particular issue. So it's really critical that we think about who are we detaining in the jail? Who are we keeping in there? Statistics, 26% of jail deaths occur within the first 3 days. And we recently at my job, we have been talking about the number of suicides that have happened within the jail. And I don't know, with COVID, I can remember having conversations with people during the time of COVID, people that were inside, and they were hopeless, because oftentimes they don't feel as though people see them as human beings. And these are people in the jails, again, most of them still under the presumption of being innocent, but they feel completely isolated. So we have to bring back the humanization of this system and make sure that we are doing what we need to do to support people. 44% of people in jail report a diagnosis of mental health. So some type of mental health disorder they've identified. So that could be personality disorder, anxiety disorder, PTSD, depression. So we have to figure out ways that we can address these things, because public health is public safety. We have to understand that the two are interconnected. And so in this work that we're doing and in this fight for reform, it is critical that we really take time to investigate what the needs are in our community, to do some system assessments and look at how effective we've been within our community and those we're serving or not serving within our jail. And I just want to say this, because I know sometimes people use these words interchangeably. And so I want to just also, just as I kind of kick it off to Greer, to talk a little bit about the ACLU and the actual bill itself. When we talk about bail reform, bail is a system of release, right? So you'll hear people talk about bail, money bail, but technically bail is the decision, is a person bailable or not, meaning should they be released or should they not be released? Bond is that money that's attached to it. So I just want to lift that up. Because sometimes people use those interchangeably, but it's really important to understand that it is a system. And so we're talking about a system change, a legal change that will occur, that will impact all the residents here within our state. So I am going to kick it off to Greer just to share a little bit about her work with the ACLU and also as it relates to this current House and Senate bill.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, and thank you to the Women's City Club for having us and having this conversation. It's very exciting because we have good news to share. And I think Dr. Zaria did a good job of kind of laying out the groundwork For those of you who don't know, the American Civil Liberties Union is an organization that's been around for 101 years, working to protect and promote civil liberties and civil rights in the United States. And so you'll see us working on a wide variety of issues, from bail reform to voting rights to reproductive justice. And we got into our work on bail reform a few years ago when we started a campaign called Smart Justice, which had a goal to decrease mass incarceration by 50%. And one of the things that we quickly realized was that bail is really the front door to mass incarceration. Once people get caught up in the pretrial system, they will have cascading consequences throughout the rest of their journey through the courts. And I think Dr. Zaria laid out many of the problems with bail. And one thing I want to add to that is that we have actually found, and other researchers have found, that once you spend time in jail pre-trial awaiting your court date, so you're there because you can't pay bail, you're actually more likely to get convicted of a crime, and you're more likely to have a longer sentence. And I think that, to me, that fact was very shocking, because it really questions the integrity of our system. And it's surprising at first, but when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Because, not only is sitting in jail for a few days extremely disruptive to your life, but it makes it very difficult to put together a good case. Even if you're in jail for just a few days, it can, cost you your housing, your job, et cetera. But on top of that, you're trying to communicate with an attorney. You're trying to gather evidence, contact witnesses, put together a solid game plan for your case. And that becomes much more difficult when you're behind bars and don't have, your cell phone to look through social media to see who you were talking to. And you have to try to get on the phone, with your lawyer for 15 minutes when you're able to use the phone. And then when you think about going in front of a judge, someone who's been sitting in jail for a few days, weeks, months, they're going to show up in a jumpsuit and handcuffs. And the only thing they have to tell their judge is that they've been sitting in jail since they were arrested. Whereas the person who was able to pay their bond and get out, they've been working, taking care of their family, contributing to their community, got a nice suit for the day of court, and they're able to present a much better picture to the judge. And so when you think about all of that together, it starts to make sense why we see more convictions and longer sentences for people who've had to spend time in jail pre-trial. And I want to say too that also exacerbates all of the economic and racial inequality that we see in the system from the first place. So not only, $100 is going to be a different amount to you, if you only have $1 in your bank account versus if you have $1 million, but we also see that people of color routinely get higher amounts of bail for the same crimes as white people. And so there's inequality baked into almost every step of the system that we're having to deal with. One of the ways that we kind of started delving into this understanding of the consequences of pretrial justice on the outcome of your court case was through a big report we released last year, our fiscal impact analysis. And this was a 2-year study that we worked with an expert economist on to look at what were the consequences of our pretrial system in Ohio, and what are the opportunities if we were to reform it. And so we found these very disturbing things about, what was happening to individual people's cases. We also found that if Ohio is to implement bail reform the way that we're proposing it and the way that's proposed in current legislation, we would actually save up to $264 million per year as a state. And that's with providing additional support to people. And so we are spending huge amounts of money just to keep people locked up. And in this research that we did, most of the people were booked. The most common crime that people were booked on was drug possession. The most common misdemeanor was driving with a suspended license. So, these are the type of crimes that we are paying millions of dollars to lock people up for, and then suffering, collateral consequences for years afterwards. And so there is good news, which we're going to talk about a lot today, which is that there is bail reform legislation that's been introduced in the House and the Senate that would actually attack many of these problems. And we at the ACLU are very excited about this legislation. In the House, it's HB 315, introduced by Representative Hillier and Representative Leland. That's a bipartisan team. And then in the Senate, it's 2 Republicans, Senator McCauley and Senator Steve Huffman, SB 182. These are companion bills. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Maureen O'Connor, was at the press conference where they announced the release of these bills, giving her support to these bills. And so it's really a rare bipartisan event that we're seeing in Ohio, and it is really, really exciting. I can go into detail about the bills, but I wanted to let Chastity talk a little bit about her work before we dig into the specific changes that these bills would make.
Sorry, I had to get myself unmuted. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to be here tonight. It is very exciting. As Greer was talking, I could feel the excitement bubbling up in me because this is a very exciting time. I've been working with Greer and Zaria on this for quite some time now, and so it's really good to see it actually moving, and we're seeing some progression in it. So my name is Chastity Bowman. I am the founder of Opportunity People's Justice Leaders. And so we start, our activism begins at the pretrial stage, and it goes through incarceration and after. So our main goal and our focus is to make sure that people are treated humanely whenever they go into the jail, whenever they go into the prisons, and when they come home, they have the resources that they need to thrive and to be able to be successful and not recidivize and go back to prison or experience the whole process over again. And so the reason that I'm here today is because I want all of you to imagine, right? I want everybody to use their imagination tonight, okay? So I want you to imagine your 5th grade self. I want you to take yourself back to when you were in 5th grade. You were probably about 11, 12 years old. And I want you to imagine not knowing how to read or write in the 5th grade. I want you to imagine that you come from a household that there is domestic violence. And when you walk down the street to take your little sister to school, all you see is negative things happening around you. You see drug dealing, you see acts of violence, and this is just you walking your sister to school. Once you get to school, you don't quite know how to tell time, but you know that if you go in when the hands are at a certain place on the clock, that the teacher writes your name on the roll and that you can walk out of the back door. But as long as you're back by the time that the hands are at a certain time on the clock, that they have counted you for the day. You know this because you have done this every day your 5th grade year of school, because it is your responsibility to go to the local gas station and pump gas for money in the 5th grade. So now you are in the 5th grade, you are skipping school, you don't know how to read or write, but it's your responsibility to bring the money home for the day to make sure that your family eats in the 5th grade. Now you are 13 and you are in middle school, and your parents have introduced you into a life of crime, into a life of selling drugs to make ends meet. Now you are responsible for making sure that the light bill is paid. You are responsible for making sure that you have clothes for school and that your sister is taken care of. Now you are 14 years old and you have your first firearm in your hand because your parents have introduced this to you, because now you have to keep yourself safe in your neighborhood where there's no opportunities for you to survive other than what you are given. Now imagine at 12 years old is the first time that you are incarcerated. And then you're 16 and you're incarcerated again. And now you're 19 and you're going to adult judges, and now you're going to adult prison. Imagine being 19 years old and being told that your bond was $360, but you didn't have the means to pay the $360. So you had to sit and wait for almost 2 years for a judge to tell you that if you didn't take a plea deal, that you could do every day but 1 year, which was 59 years. Just imagine. Just imagine feeling like that you could fight your case if you had the means to do it, the monetary means, the support of family, or even a friend, or somebody that just cared. So you take the deal. Even though you had no participation in the crime, you take the deal and you are sentenced with 2 other people and you go to jail, prison for 9 years. Within those 9 years, you rehabilitate yourself. You meet someone, they introduce you to a different way of life. You learn how to read, you learn how to write, you take every program that they offer, and then you get a college education. But yet and still, that's not enough for the court to say that you can come home. That is the story of my husband. That is how I got here. I met him in 2016 while he was doing 2 years into a 9-year bid. We were married in 2018, and I was introduced to this world of incarceration that I did not know existed. And as time went on, I began to see the injustices that people were facing, and I couldn't stomach not saying anything about it. And so I became his advocate, then I became an activist, and now I'm a voice for 50,000 people incarcerated across Ohio. Bail reform is very important because if he would have had someone that cared and would have put up $360, if he would have had someone to show him a different way of life in the 5th grade, the 6th grade, the 7th grade, the 8th grade, he would not have experienced the trauma of 7.5 years in prison. And although he has truly rehabilitated himself, we're still fighting the courts to say he hasn't done enough. So I'm saying all that to say is because I want you all to imagine that when you hear that story on the news and you say to yourself, why did that kid do that? Or how did they have a gun at 12? That is why. Because they're victims of circumstance. They are victims of they are products of their environment. There are no resources to give them any other options. And so I want to speak to some of the judges that are here tonight. Is when you're looking at these cases, I know you can't put your heart in everything that you do, but my plea is just to ask the question of, sir or ma'am, how did you get here? How did you get here? To think about what diversion programs can we put in place. $264 million, as Greer said. We could take that $264 million and we can create diversion programs that will stop folks from going to jail and prison, rehabilitate them, put the resources that they need to be better people. Sometimes all people need is a chance. And I learned that from my husband. He didn't know how to write in cursive and he was afraid to tell me because I would write letters to him in cursive. And so he took my letters and he would trace them until he taught himself how to do it. That tells me that he's a very intelligent person, that he just needs someone to redirect his behavior. And so tonight, I hope that everyone could imagine with me on how all of us could vote on this bill and how we can make this a possibility for another person like my husband, because there's so many like him. There's so many sitting right now in Hamilton County Justice Center, just like him. And so that is my piece, and that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Chastity. So I've known Chastity for years, and I feel like I always learn something new about her husband in this process and this journey. I just want to lift up a few things from what you just said, and we can definitely kind of open this up and have dialogue. So, you know, when I do a lot of like the history and things like that, we talk about how like in other cultures and societies, they have more of a restorative justice approach, where it's not always so punitive, but really thinking about not only how you restore an individual, but also communities. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that you just lifted up, Chastity, is that it wasn't just like his household, even though it was, but it was also a community thing. So how do we work to, you know, restore our communities, restore people, and provide those resources and supports that people need? And if you listen to Chastity's story, there were so many other intersecting systems that played into this, right? So it wasn't just the criminal legal system, but the education system. And then oftentimes it's the social service system, and it could be the healthcare system. So when we talk about the impact and how this not just impacts an individual, but their families and communities, understanding that if you don't have the support from family and friends and you have a child and you get arrested, who's going to get involved? Social services. If you have a situation where someone has been victimized and they've, you know, needed medical treatment but haven't gotten it, you have the healthcare system involved. So there are all these different intersecting pieces that have an impact on, you know, on this work. And I think that when we talk about the bail reform piece, I think that other money is going to be saved, right? Like we talk about this within a criminal legal system, how much money is going to be saved. But imagine if people are home with their children, if people are working their jobs, if people have that ability, how many other systems that we intersect with will also, you know, have money saved, especially social services, because I've just seen way too many people, unfortunately, lose their children because they've been detained in a jail and had to really fight to get their kids back as a result. But just wanted to get your thoughts about with this bill. How do you feel like it will impact, you know, the other systems and, you know, and families and community here, not only in Hamilton County, but also, you know, throughout our state?
I feel as though that if this bill goes into effect, I mean, one, economically, it's wise. You know, we could take that money and, as I said before, we could create, okay, so we could send 70 kids to college. I mean, we broke the numbers down. We could send 70 kids in urban neighborhoods to college on $264 million. Again, I'll lift up the diversion programs. The reason why I say a diversion program is because a lot of these people who are in this position pretrial, they don't know how to read or write, or they have an IEP. You know, they have educational barriers. You know, so if we had a diversion program to get to the core of how we can help them, you know, what is the core reason that you're here? You will find that it is a community issue, right? It goes back to the community, you know, and so I feel as though it's just economically, it's just right. It's the right thing to do, you know, and it will absolutely lessen the population that we see filtering into our prisons, you know, that's a fact. It'll definitely lessen that. So I think that for me, it's just economically right, and that the money could just be filtered back into our communities to develop more resources, more after school programs and diversion programs to keep people out of jails and prison.
And I just want to, you mentioned diversion. So I just want to also mention that every time I'm in a space with law enforcement, I just need everybody to know that I ask the exact same question every time. And that question is about their use of citation and release, as well as deflection. So those are components before a person would even go to the jail, right? So before you get to diversion programs and everything else, there are things on the law enforcement side that could potentially be done to also eliminate people from going into our jails. And unfortunately, I don't see it utilized to the full extent of what it could be. And citation as release is just that. So you cite the person to court, but you never actually process them within the jail. And then with deflection, that really takes and requires like connection, right, to communities and understanding like the people in the communities and understanding systems. But the programs are set up to basically, if you notice that a person has a mental health, issue or substance use issue, instead of arresting them and punishing them, to actually refer them to another resource or service that can actually address that issue. I think the challenge with diversion programs often is cost, because right now, for most diversion programs, there's some type of cost that's associated with this. So I definitely think that if we could provide these alternatives, I call them alternatives, in addition to what we're talking about with the reform, I think that we would see more productive people, especially getting them connected, as Chastity mentioned, to different resources and supports. I know in the chat, we had a question around people kind of getting on the judges because they feel like the amounts are too low that they set, right? And so I think that goes back to this whole public safety and this fear that we, instill in our communities. Like, if you let people out, something bad is going to happen, right? And in our research, only 5% of people are technically charged, 5% are charged with what we call violent crimes, right? So this is not the bulk of the people that come through our system. But unfortunately, what happens is, if there's any type of incident that occurs with a person who has like a charge like that, then the media and, depending on people's opponents, if they're running for office, it gets completely blown out. Like, oh, they let like 100 people go and 100 people did this bad thing. Whereas if you let 100 people go and that one person did something or violated, somehow it's a reflection of everybody. And so I know that judges have that challenge, right, of like, what's really like the law and the right thing to do versus like, I want to get reelected. I need to make sure that my constituents are happy with me. And a lot of times we hear this whole, again, public safety. But my question is, have we seen significant changes in public safety after these people win? Like that is a huge thing. So I'm going to kick it to Greer if you want to share thoughts as it relates to that, or just connecting it to the bill itself.
Yeah. Thank you. I was thinking about the bill itself in relation to this, because we hear this a lot from judges, and, they have a burden on them to be the decision maker. And the way our system is set up right now is truly wealth-based detention. So you either have the money to pay your bond or you don't. The proposed changes in this bill really shift the framework, and they create a framework for judges to use to make decisions that I think can be something that they can rely on and say, well, I followed the law. This is the new guideline. So what the bills do is they create a release path. So the default is that anyone who's arrested is released within 24 hours of their arrest with no cash bond on what is called OR bond or cognizance. So that means on their promise to return to court. So that becomes the default, which is in itself a significant change. There is still a mechanism, though, for judges or prosecutors to flag if they think that someone is a flight risk or a threat to someone else. If they flag them, then they have a hearing within 48 hours where they have an opportunity to look at the evidence in front of them. There's a lawyer present, and they can actually look, first of all, is this likely to be the person who committed this crime? And then what do we need to do to maintain safety or to make sure that they show up to court? Do we need to have them check in once a week? Do we need to say, you can't have contact with the alleged victim? There's lots of different options that judges can use. And then there's also safeguards in place. So one of the significant parts of this bill is it doesn't eliminate cash bail. It eliminates wealth-based detention. So judges can still assign cash bail, but it can only be, cannot be more than 25% of someone's income minus expenses, so that they are actually able to pay it. And then last, and probably the most important for us, is that judges are required to put written findings on the record. So they justify why they're making the decisions that they're making. Right now, it's set this bond, move on to the next person, set a bond, move on to the next person. This kind of breaks up that process and creates a much more intentional and individualized way for judges to make decisions about cases. And to me, that first of all enhances public safety and everyone's experience in the court system, but it creates a framework for judges to make decisions that really doesn't exist right now, and hopefully will be something for them to fall back on if they get unfair criticism. But I think, we can't be afraid of criticism and let that hamstring us from making changes that are really going to get to the heart of the problem. And we can't fall into believing the fear mongering that we know is out there and we're going to continue to hear. But part of this is just changing the framework of how we even think about what the problem is. And so, I think that this bill what actually provides more tools for judges and really codifies a lot of the guidance that has come out from the Supreme Court in the last few years.
Thank you, Greer. And I appreciate you lifting that up. I think that, as mentioned in the chat, like this is something that we discuss quite a bit with judges, and just understanding that by having a high bond amount does not ensure it just doesn't ensure public safety. Keeping a person in the jail because they are poor does not make the communities any safer, because a judge can decide to keep a person if they actually feel like that person is going to do harm to someone else, right? I think that that's the challenge that we deal with quite a bit. And as Greer mentioned, we have this every election, right? We have these conversations about the whole tough on crime and, public safety. And, it's like, yeah, here we are again, we're in 2021 and we're still having these same conversations. And so what can we do differently than what we've been doing, right? Like it's broken, like something is not working. So how do we change this where we are becoming more effective as a community, as a judicial system, as advocates, to ensure that people have the resources and supports that they need? When you are arresting people because they can't afford to have food on their table, right? They're shoplifting and things like that. Like the problem isn't that they committed the crime. The problem is that they are hungry. The problem is that they need access to food and resources. And so we're penalizing people and we're punishing people because they are poor, because they are in poverty, instead of actually looking at some of these root causes as Chastity mentioned, as to why they are there in the first place. And so I just want to lift that up because I think it's really important to really think about that. And I think that when we have that, like, when we are cranking people in and out, oftentimes in the system, like this person goes and then the next person, you don't have that opportunity to actually hear a person's story, especially at the very beginning, right? So it's like you hear what the presenting charges are and you kind of make a decision off of that. And so I think that it's important to be able to consider these things about a person, especially people's ability to pay, and also thinking about like what resources and what's going on in their lives. Do they have children that they just left at home? Like what is actually happening? So I just want to, if Chastity, I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to lift up as it relates to this. And I would also just, as we're talking about this, understand that this is going to impact like jail size, right, as well. So we keep talking about like we have these large jails. I mean, these jails that are overcrowded and, they're bursting at the seams. But again, over 50%, oftentimes over 60% are people there for pretrial. So it also is going to impact what our local jails look like and what the needs and services are for the people that are currently in there. So I don't know if either one of you all kind of want to speak to how that may show up as well with this particular bill as it relates to the local jails.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because that was the next thing that was on my mind. It would definitely impact the census that we have at our local jail. I'm working with Sheriff McGuffey now, along with the NAACP, about this exact issue. The census is fairly decent right now. I probably want to give a shout out to the Bell Project for that, because they work very, very feverishly and hard to get folks, bonded out and get them out. But this bill would absolutely bring down the census number and the overcrowding that we do see, on our local level alone. back when we had the COVID issue, and you have COVID, and then you have an overpopulated jail, in which, yes, some people were released. We're still not sure where they were released to. We don't have that data. We assume that they went to prison for the most part, and that's something that we just don't want. If it's avoidable and we can avoid that, we can avoid that next step. That's all we're trying to do, and this bill would absolutely do that, and I totally push for it. But I wanted to go back to, I think it's Miss Allen was saying about how supporting judges who do set bonds at a low. We understand the criticism that judges face. We totally do. That's why we made sure we got out to the polls. We got our people out to the polls, and we flipped those seats down there at the courthouse, because we felt like the people that are there now would make the difference, and they would do it boldly, they would do it fairly, they would do it fiercely. And so we totally support the efforts, and we know that the criticism that you face, and that's why we're here to be your voice, to stand behind you, but we're also here to hold everybody accountable, to make sure that when this bill passed, or whenever the city passed the ordinance, we got so much pushback on that from judges. When the city passed the ordinance, they didn't want to honor it, and so we spoke at the polls, and we said how we felt and where we were. And so we're just in a place of accountability right now. We just want to hold everybody accountable to making sure that we adhere to this, and that we push this bill through, and that we work together just to make things better.
I want to address, I'm going in the chat as we're going. And so there's a comment about failure to appear. And so this is a big topic, right? Failure to appear is a big topic in my world, because typically when we have these conversations about failure to appear, at least in the interactions that I've had more recently, it's oftentimes, again, barriers that people have that are impacting them showing up to court. So it's not like they just flew to another country and they're like, I'm out. I'm not going to face the judge. It may be a person doesn't have childcare. They have transportation issues. Their job basically told them if they miss another day at work because their court date's been rescheduled 50 times, that they're going to lose their job, right? So I think that it's critical to again, as Chastity mentioned, to understand that these oftentimes are people who have very limited resources as it is. And then when you take away the few resources that they do have, or you have them showing up to court and they get there and they like, oh, it's been rescheduled, come back, in another month. Oh, it's been rescheduled again. Oh, you didn't need to be here for today, but you do need to be back next week. All of those kind of things factor into people's lives, right? So I think that there's one county that I worked with once. They actually had a childcare facility at their courthouse because they understood that was a barrier for people. I know that there's been conversation about people being able to take their summons for court and be able to use it for a metro to be able to get to court. So, and I don't know if this still happens, but I've even heard over time, and this may be really old, but people are standing in line to get through the metal detectors. And by the time they get in, their name has already been called and a warrant has been issued. So, I mean, we have to eliminate these types of barriers, right? To see what the numbers really look like when we talk about failure to appear, and how that impacts, the decisions that the judges are making. So I just wanted to lift that up. I mean, I know that there are also other circumstances where people do not appear, but I think for the most part, people want it over, right? They don't want this to prolong. They want it over, but it's just a situation of how do we make sure that the resources and supports are in place to get people to court? And so Chastity mentioned the Bail Project. So we have an organization here called the Bail Project. It's been here, how long? It's been a year now. I'm trying to think, it's been about a year. Jeremy Page is the person who is running that, and he is doing such an amazing job. And so this is a rotating fund that allows people to be bonded out. And then once their disposition, has occurred, then that money goes back into the fund. And then it's used again to help somebody else. And so this is a fund that it's a national organization, but they also connect people to resources and services. And they also really do a good job of like doing like court reminders and things like that. And so I think it's critical when we talk about, you know, people showing up, like that we are putting things in place. Like when I go to the doctor, you know, I get text reminders, phone call reminders, but why can't we do that with a court date? You know, like, why can't we remind a person like, hey, you got court coming up? Because trust me, I just did a post. If it's not on my calendar, I might just forget it, right? So I think that we have to understand that people have busy lives and that it may not always be intentional that people don't show up, but being able to take that and really try to understand what those challenges are. I definitely would say check out the Bail Project if people have an opportunity. We also have another bail fund that works in collaboration with the Bail Project, because the Bail Project sometimes has limitations on who they can bond out. Beloved Community Church also has a bail fund, and they work in collaboration with the Bail Project. So if it's a person that the Bail Project may not be able to help to get out, Beloved Community also will take that money and get people out as well. So we do have two amazing groups that are helping people financially, where people don't have to take that hit, right? Families don't have to try to give up a house or, you know, sacrifice their rent for the month, because that's what people are dealing with, right? When they have to try to bond their family member out. And then some families just can't. They just don't have the ability to do that. But just really understanding that, you know, we have to look at who are the people who are sitting in our jails, who are the people who have the warrants out because they didn't show, like, what is the makeup of these people? And so that goes to a whole nother piece of data collection, right? Like, how is data being collected in our county and in our state when it comes to our jails and the people that are showing up? And I think that there's been a lot of conversation around data collection on a state level as well as a local level, and the lack of data that exists, you know, when it comes to these things. And so I think that there are all these different layers, right, that we have to look at when we're talking about these systems and how it shows up. I think that, as Chastity mentioned, you know, we have people that are in place that can make some significant changes within our judicial system. I think that across the board here in Hamilton County, there's some things that can be moved in a progressive manner to really benefit the poor and the people who are lacking the resources and supports that are needed. And I think that it is critical for everybody that is currently here to get engaged in these conversations. Thank you again, you know, for being in this space. But then even after this, like, we're going to give you some ways that you can get involved, like towards the end, but we want to challenge you to continue to be involved. I know someone asked a question about can judges speak out? So I think this is interesting, right? Because our Supreme Court justice spoke out, you know, and she typically takes she kind of leads the way, I think, a lot of times when it comes to judges and, you know, like how they show up in these different spaces. You know, I want to encourage people to, you know, share as judges, like maybe, you know, I don't know how far you can go, but you can think about, like, how is this going to benefit your courtroom? How is this going to benefit the work that you're doing that was already, as I already mentioned, how is this going to show up where there's accountability on your end, but also on the end of your colleagues as well. So I just want to put that out there, as that was mentioned. Can judges speak out on this? Literally at the press conference, I think she was the first person that spoke at the press conference to introduce it. So I'm gonna pass it to Greer or Chastity if they want to add anything else, and then I'm gonna look at the chat just so if there are other things that we need to address that we can.
I want to make sure before we end to let you know what's coming next with the bill. So both of these bills have been introduced in the House and the Senate. They've had their initial sponsor hearings. And then in the Senate, we had our first proponent testimony June 16th, where we and members of our action team, Chastity, were able to share their testimony and talk about why they supported the bills. I know you probably don't usually sit around watching the Ohio channel, but I have to say it was a wonderful hearing. So I'll share the link and you can go through and hear different people's testimony from experts, the people who've been directly impacted, to people with family members in the system, all sharing why they support this bill. Right now, the OGA is on summer recess, so they'll come back in September, and we expect that hearings will continue. We'll still have to have the proponent hearing in the House, and then we'll start to hear from opponents and interested parties. And so one of the things that you can do right now is sign up for our action team and join us on our Tuesday civic action nights. Every Tuesday we get together and we work on preparing testimony for those hearings that are coming and engaging in text banks to spread the word about this bill. And so I'll also put a link in the chat to sign up for our action team and get involved that way. Our work